Hi there. I just also wanted to make a longer video. So I just finished recording a reel, which is something that I usually struggle with a bit because it's hard for me to make content that's very, very concise because I really always want people to fully understand what I'm explaining, because a lot of the work that I have to do is help people get all of the things they've already picked up along their path before and put it in the right context. And short form content is something to very easily pick up things, but then it's also very easy to take those things out of context or use them in the wrong way. And something you will hear me say a lot is everything is just a tool. Everything is just information. What you do with that tool or that information, that is what determines whether or not it's something positive or negative. And that goes just for about everything. So yesterday we started our week 4 of my program, Raising Yourself Right. And that means this week is all about learning to work with our belief system, which is the very basis of our functioning, because our brain is really designed to do about anything it can for us to stay in alignment with what we believe. So that is the very first component. If we really want to change our life, we have to change our belief system and not just take out the things that are not good, but everything that you take out, you have to replace, right? Because otherwise things just collapse. And then also, that's not very helpful. So I made this very long lesson. It became very long because every time that I do it, I think like, oh yes, of course, that's also something that people should know about. And oh, of course, that's something that now I've learned along the way of doing this work for so long and working with more and more people every time. So you start learning more and more things as well. So I keep adding on things, so it became a really long lesson. And I was happy to hear this morning that some of the students thought it was a good lesson. But it also made me realize a bunch of things, or made me even consider and think about a lot of things. So I kind of felt like sharing a bit about it. And probably what I want to start with first is what I actually made the reel about, because I finally managed to condense it basically in 3 sentences. But the thing that I thought about, because I know how it's so process, like, okay, what do I want to share? And I make a journaling exercise every day about what do I want to share with people? What do I want people to know? What do I feel like teaching today? And it was this thing that yesterday popped up again, and it's something that I've come across quite often. And for some reason, it always like surprises me over and over again, that it's so confusing for people, that they have it so mixed up. And that is like every time, not every time, but quite often when I ask somebody, okay, like write a list of your beliefs, they will write a lot of things that start with I feel like. But when you start with I feel like, you're describing a feeling, not a belief. And it just made me realize that because these things go so hand in hand during the programming that actually creates this belief, people have it so confused and mixed up and entangled together that they can't see that they're actually separate elements. And if we don't separate them out again, they form this impenetrable loop. And no matter how much we work with it, you can't really get anything changed in it, because it's like, yeah, it's just tight, it's closed, and you cannot get it to change because it's like an automatic feedback loop onto each other. So we need to separate it out back into its separate elements, which is, well, you went through an experience. Like a lot of these things come from traumatic experiences. And traumatic experiences, for those of you who don't know me and haven't worked with me, is not necessarily a huge tragedy or a huge horrific abuse like a lot of people think about it. It can be, but it doesn't need to be. A trauma is basically anything that happened to us that caused us to have a very strong emotional reaction that we felt like we couldn't handle, that was so intense inside, and we had no way to process that, to handle that, to communicate that to anybody else, that it felt like a threat to our life, and it caused a pattern of fragmentation inside of us. And in that process of that fragmentation, to make sense out of what is happening and to have these two separate parts, they often also have certain thoughts that go together with that as that's happening. And because there is so much emotional energy in that process, that creates a very deep imprint because that has a lot of energy behind it, okay? To develop a belief, we either needed to repeat a lot over and over and over again so that we each time get like a little bit deeper and a little bit deeper and a little bit deeper. And after a while, it's like this really deeply ingrained thing that's an automatic belief system within our system. But it can also be that something happened with such a high intensity that it digs like a really big, deep trench just in this one go. And so when things like that happen, and it can be smaller things like over time, but it can also be this like very deep imprint in one go. Yet those thoughts that we had back then was the only thing we had as a reference for what was happening. And there was another very interesting thing that happened, or a very interesting question that came during yesterday's session, where I was asked, like, what's the difference between truth and a belief? And so I've been thinking about it, and there is like no absolute line for that. Because if you think about when a few centuries ago we had no technology, people would believe the earth is flat. Why would you believe the earth is flat? Because when you walk, it looks flat. When you walk, even when you walk long distance, when you travel long distance, as long as you're staying on the water or on land, you'll see mountains and whatnot. But there is nothing in our perception that can give us information that it is round. There is nothing that we have to go on. There is no extra information that will give us that. It's only when we started understanding some more patterns and some more physics, and eventually only until we got the images from outer space that would show us, well, we're actually not on a flat thing, we're on a round thing. Now we have that information, and our truth went from the earth is flat, which was the best we could come up with the information that we had, with the perception that we had, to now, well, we have different information which shows it's round. So there is a thin line between belief and truth. But there is also something as reality and common sense and just making the best assessment that you can. And that's the same thing that happens when we are children and we develop these belief systems. It could be something like, if you were a child that was kind of angry at times because you wanted things, but then your parents would shame you for feeling that anger and expressing that anger, and scolding you and saying, well, you're an ungrateful person because you have so many things, and look at the little children in Africa who don't have food. That can lead to you whenever you feel angry, also feeling shame and believing you're an ungrateful person. So if I would then have to write this list of beliefs and I'm confused about it, I would write something like, I feel like I'm an ungrateful person. Yes, that means that I believe that I am an ungrateful person. But as long as I stay with, I feel like I'm an ungrateful person, there is not really anything to do, because if you want to resolve a belief, if you want to change a belief because it's detrimental to us, we have to start questioning it. And we have to kind of shake it loose, and we have to start seeing where it's a lie, and we have to start seeing where that's wrong. But if I stay with, I feel like I am an ungrateful person, there is no wiggling room in that, because that literally is the reality. That is what you feel like, because that is what you have made this feeling mean to you. So we have to separate it out. I feel angry and ashamed, and I make that belief that I am an ungrateful person because I was told this over and over and over again. So I have taken this information that was available to me and I have accepted it as truth. But just like people a few centuries ago had no other information, you didn't have any other information as a child, but now as an adult, you have other information, you have other perspectives. You can see your parents were who they were. Maybe they were very stressed at the time. Maybe they didn't know how to handle children. Can be many, many, many reasons. Maybe they just did that because they thought that was right. Maybe they just said that because that's what they learned from their parents. But now you can see that, wait a minute, actually, I was angry because I felt injustice about something else. But I didn't know how to say that. I didn't know how to express that. My parents couldn't handle anger because they were never taught to handle anger, and they labeled it as bad. So they just wanted this and this and this. But now I can see all of those things are not true. I can see my parents were limited in their capacity. I can see I was limited in my capacity. But now I can see how that is a lie, and I can choose to change that. I can choose to change my beliefs in, if I feel anger, that anger must be there for an important reason, and it must have an important message for me, but I must really carefully listen what that message is. And I can change my belief to, I am very grateful for the life I have and the things that I have, but it doesn't mean I have to agree with everything. It doesn't mean if I feel like I want something more in my life, that does not automatically mean that I am an ungrateful person for the things that I do have. And that makes it workable. That way you can separate these things out. That way you can see, where all of the problems are within that very tight construct. Because it doesn't mean that there are not like elements of truth in that construct. But usually we end up with things like absolutes. I am always a failure. Things never go my way. No, like maybe you failed at some point. It doesn't mean you're a failure, and it doesn't mean you will always fail. And if you're honest about it and you start looking at your life, you will be able to find pieces of evidence that showed you, well, at that point I actually didn't fail. At that point I helped someone. At that point someone was very grateful that I was there. At that point I did this and it was successful. But if you stick to, I feel like a failure, you have no wiggle room, because that is actually true. You feel like a failure because you feel a certain way and you have attached a belief to it that you feel like a failure. So I just wanted to come in here and just explain this a little bit, because I do think it will help a lot of people to understand that. because I know a lot of people try to work on this, but they get very confused about it. So I hope that this information helps you a little bit to get more clarity about it. And now we can start separating these things out and actually working on the separate parts. And that way you will be able to wiggle those lies free and implement things instead that are helpful and will help you move forward in your life. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you on the next one. Bye.